afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this IUA market briefing. It's good to see so many people online. We are remote only today, so we'll take through any chatting questions on Zoom rather than anyone in the room. But welcome. We've got a great presentation this afternoon looking at INCOTERMS. I'm delighted to welcome on Mielken, who's an MD at Customs Manager Limited. Now, On has been a global trade consultant and trainer since, I think, 2011. And since 2020, he's been the MD of Customs Manager Limited. Now, On did a 20-minute session at the cargo conference in, I think it was June, and was so well received, we thought we would invite him back to do a slightly longer session looking at INCOTERMS, how to simplify, streamline marine claims using INCOTERMS, and probably hopefully pick up on some of the common issues that arise in terms of potential liabilities and perhaps misuse of the terms. Now, we are recording this session, as you probably heard as you joined the call, and we'll make that recording available post briefing. Good news as well, On has kindly agreed to circulate the slides that he's about to share. A lot of information in there. In terms of questions, as I said before, we'll take those through the Zoom chat function. So if you have any, feel free to add them there, and then On and I can pick them towards the end of the session. I think, On, you're going to speak for 30 minutes or so. And with that, I'll pass over to you. And I'll pick it up post-presentation. On.
Great. Fantastic. Well, thanks, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us this afternoon to talk about INCOTERMS. This is really great. And I had the pleasure of meeting some of you, if not most of you, in summer. The weather was certainly better. It was very warm, I remember. Now, if I look outside, it looks rather bleak. But the one thing that's constant is that INCOTERMS are still around. Is that not amazing? Well, I'm Arnie. I'm German by birth, so that explains the little accent. But I live in the UK, and I get to talk about INCOTERMS as well as customs and global trade, so import, export, and that takes a flavor of its own in the context of Brexit, because now we actually have a fully fledged customs border between us and the continent, and us and the Republic of Ireland. If we're talking about the UK, if we're situated in London or where else in the UK, and that makes the area of customs and global trade, and therefore INCOTERMS, all the more interesting. I've been asked to talk about INCOTERMS and dispel the myth and give you some pointers and ideas of where the risks are for you, for insurers, when seeing INCOTERMS in contracts, but also in conversation, and help you streamline the approach to INCOTERMS. Now, I have some slides for you. We can talk much more than the 30 minutes I'm going to talk about INCOTERMS. We can talk much more about INCOTERMS past the 30 minutes. But this is really just a flavor and an introduction to the complexity that is INCOTERMS, even though it is in itself a simplification. So yeah, you can see it's already getting quite paradoxical. So why don't I get started and share the screen and talk you through the INCOTERMS, and then there'll be ample opportunity for us to pick up your questions. So don't hesitate, put the question in the chat, and we'll then pick it up afterwards. So let me start by sharing my screen and give you a some brief thoughts about the INCOTERMS. So the topic of the presentation, as you should see right now, and I hope you can all see the screen. If you don't, then please also write a message in the chat, and then the chair can pick this up. He will take a good look at the chat. I can't see the chat while I am presenting, so please do not hesitate. If you can't see me, if you can't hear me, then probably you won't know that you're supposed to use the chat. But assuming you can see me, let's talk about INCOTERMS, simplifying and streamlining maritime claims with INCOTERMS. Now, I should say that I'm a qualified trainer on INCOTERMS, so I have been certified by the official international chambers of commerce. I've been educated, I passed exams to be able to talk about INCOTERMS and to teach INCOTERMS 2020 the way they are meant to be taught. So there is a certification scheme without which we're not formally Incoterms trainers, but you're talking to an Incoterm trainer who's certified by the ICC. So what are Incoterms then? Let's get started and dive in a little. Now, you may deal with Incoterms every day, or you may not at all. You may have a deep knowledge of Incoterms, or you're very confused by everything. It doesn't really matter, because we're all going to start at the same point, and then we're going to bring everybody up and close some of the gaps, and in the end, we're all going to be at a really good level of Incoterm knowledge within the next 27 minutes. So this session is a little educational. I hope you don't mind, rather than a discussion point on various points. So just bear with, and then we can pick it up in the discussion. So Incoterms, if you kind of separate the term, or you split it in different parts, you could have the in, the co, and then the terms. And let's start with that. So in, as you can see on the screen, stands for international. And often we just pass on, we'll go to the next part, but if we just hold there for a moment, international is what this is all about. Incoterms matter where we trade across borders, across different countries, where we cross one jurisdiction into another. This is where we need to know what the rules, regulations, and costs are. This is where we need to know what the imports are supposed to do, what the exports are supposed to do, or if we talk in Incoterm speak, what the buyer is supposed to do and what the seller is supposed to do. And if we don't have clarity on this, it's going to get messy, and you're going to get insurance claims, and you're going to get into heated discussions, and sometimes nasty lawsuits about who has to pay what. So Incoterms prevent that, but they need to be used in the right way. So IN stands for international. So when we talk about cross-border movement. Commercial means relations between companies. This is not a private exchange. This is about one company entering, or a person entering a commercial transaction with someone else. And then terms can mean all sorts of things, but usually we understand them to be conditions of an agreement. So there is an agreement that has been made at international level between companies in a cross-border transaction. There is a commercial contract. There is some sort of legal relationship. And in this legal relationship, we agree how we're going to trade. So this is the key feature. Incoterms only matter really when it is about international commerce and where we have a contract of sorts where the terms are stipulated. And rather than spelling out every little detail of who does what, we just use the Incoterms. This is written up by the International Chamber of Commerce, and this is registered in several countries. But the International Chamber of Commerce is not itself a government. It is not itself really anything apart from a trade body. It is where international commerce, so the businesses that trade globally, collectively, come together and decide on rules, precisely the Incoterm rules. And this is why the ICC has the de facto authority over Incoterms. And as such, we now have specific guidance to individuals participating in the import and the export of global trade rules on a daily basis. One thing that people misunderstand very often with Incoterms is that they think this is law, that there is some kind of law in the European Union, in America, in China, that say Incoterms are law. And in customs, in a certain field in the area of customs valuation, they do actually become law, but that's a different field. What we are talking about here is the recommended guidance, practices, agreed practices as per the ICC, and written in a book. They are not law. They are at best contract and part of contract law, if incorporated into commercial contracts. So the way they can be enforced is just by contract law. So this means you can do anything you want with Incoterms. There is nowhere you can take anyone to a court of non-compliance with law and legislation. This can only be a commercial dispute, and it requires you to incorporate the Incoterms into your contracts, which is why it is so important that when you do provide a service based on Incoterms, or you give some insurance, or you provide a some finance or so, that you are aware of the impact of Incoterms and that they are properly and correctly inserted into the various contracts. So the first thing to remember is that Incoterms are not law of the land. They become a commercial law issue if incorporated into the contract. But that also means that the Incoterms could be changed to whatever you want them to be. If you don't like one Incoterm, you could modify it. It's not recommended, but you could, provided again that you stipulated in law. And it also means that although the Incoterms say a lot of things, you really need a strong understanding of what Incoterms actually are and what they don't do. You equally need to know what they do and what they don't do before you can even correctly incorporate this into law, meaning you can incorporate this into a contract. And that means, in turn, and then we're done with that point, that you need to know, not only you need to know what, when you add it to a contract, it actually means, but more importantly, your client, your supplier, your customer needs to be on the same page. If you understand an Incoterm to mean X, then you need to make sure that your trading partners or your customers understand this to mean X as well. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because we abbreviate the Incoterm to a 3-letter term, and we assume that everybody knows what this is all about, when in fact there is a lot of confusion happening. One of the confusion is the question of which version of Incoterms am I even going to use? Because if you look through the internet and you look through your history and you've worked with Incoterms for years, you know that in 2020, we updated the Incoterms and we created new Incoterms and we threw out old Incoterms. And this means Incoterms are now in its 2020 version. But there was a 2010 version, and there was a 2000, and so on and so on and so on. So Incoterms evolve and are revised every decade. So which one are we using? So when you get to incorporate Incoterms into a contract and you get to speak about Incoterms, you want to use them, one of the first things you need to agree is which Incoterms are we going to use? And again, there is no right or wrong answer, because in theory, at least, they all exist, because this is not law. It's not like one is revoked and the other one is the only one we can use. Because it is not law, and because this is more pure guidance, we can decide to use whatever version of Incoterms we want. Although, of course, recommended is that we all use Incoterm 2020, the latest version. What we can't have is that one operates on Incoterms 2010, and then 2020 is the work of another party to the transaction or to the contract. So we need to make sure that we use the right Incoterms and the same Incoterms, and therefore the best thing to do is to add the name, the year next to it. So Incoterms 2010 or Incoterms 2020, and as I said, I train on Incoterms 2020. So be mindful that when there are discussions on Incoterm, you specify the year. Now, if you joined me in June, I spent a lot of time on this slide with you. And I explained, and you may remember that we split the room in 2 parts, and there was one part that was the buyer and one part that was the seller. And I said, well, actually, there is absolutely no conflict in the relationship between buyer and seller. And people were quite confused. They were like, well, why does the slide say it's a conflicting relationship when there is no conflict, as Arnie says? And of course, there is a conflict. But if you look not so closely, you might actually think, well, why would there be a conflict? Because if you take about the obligation, buyer and seller both agree that they don't want any obligations. So they agree. When you think about costs, both the buyer and the seller both agree that they do not want to have any costs. And if you take about risk, so you ship goods across the ocean and the sea monster comes and drowns the vessel, right? Who's got the risk? Who's got the costs? Who's got the relationship? Who's got the obligations? Again, here the buyer and the seller agree, we do not want the risk. So neither buyer nor seller want the risk, neither buyer nor seller want the costs, nor do they want the obligations. But of course, although they all agree, both buyer and seller agree on all these fundamental points, the reason why this doesn't work is because they're on polar opposites. And that means you cannot have no risk for the buyer and no risk for the seller. Where the buyer has no risk, the seller has all risk, and vice versa. And the same for freight, costs, and obligations. So given that there is this natural conflict between buyer and seller, it becomes a question of negotiation and, I guess, bargaining power and lots of other reasons that I don't even know about. So rather than us describing for every transaction what the responsibility of the buyer is versus what the costs of the seller is, we have the Incoterms. And the Incoterms help you then decide who does what, who has what cost, who has what risk, and who has what obligation. Now, you may think this is a pure commercial issue. And this has touch points only between the buyer and the seller. So there's a buyer in the company, there's a seller in the company, and boom, they have the Incoterms to deal with. If you thought so, then you are gravely mistaken. Incoterms pop up everywhere. They are a cross-company issue. And when you decide on claims, when you decide on whether you engage in transactions or you agree to a certain trade, you agree to help fund certain trade or ensure certain trade, you need to be aware that, or your customers should be aware, I should think, that Incoterms affect many internal stakeholders within a company. There is procurement, they deal with purchase contracts, right? And they should set out specific Incoterms. There is the sales function, they provide quotation to customers and they mention Incoterms. Are they trained up? Do they know what they're talking about? There's finance, right? The Incoterms on the purchase order will provide an explanation as to what additional costs need to be included in the so-called landed cost in an international transaction. Accounting is affected by Incoterms because it has to accept or reject freight invoices, insurance invoices, etc., based on the Incoterms. Obviously, legal is involved with the drafting of contracts and the incorporation of an Incoterm to a contract. And if legal, accounting, finance, sales, and procurement don't talk to each other, we might agree completely different Incoterms, which is going to make this very messy. Here, I mentioned trade, but I could have mentioned customs as well. This is important to provide the correct instructions to the brokers because they need to create the customs declaration. And you need to obviously calculate the customs value on the basis of the Incoterm. Import-export clearance will depend on Incoterms. There is a legal requirement. And on logistics, of course, because again, I need to know, am I picking up the shipment? Where am I picking it up? Where am I bringing it to? Where do I change trucks? Where am I unloading it? Where am I where I'm loading it? Do I need to do the checking, the packing, the marking? Who needs to do what? You can see Incoterms is not just a one-person thing. The whole company is affected. While we're at this, you can expand this thing to impact the external stakeholders of the transactions as well. So not only are the people inside your company affected, but what about suppliers? What about customers? What about freight forwarders? What about the bank? What about you? What about the governments? We are all in the same boat. If the insurers don't understand the Incoterms, or the bank misunderstand the Incoterms, or any of these actors, this is going to cost delay, this is going to cost friction, this is going to create a less than smooth transaction. And that's going to lead to a lot of litigations and problems, all because Incoterms were misunderstood. So what is the lesson here? Train. Train on Incoterms, train broadly, and actually as insurer, I would probably, and I can say this because I'm just a consultant, so I don't need to worry about the ins and outs of it. I would probably insist as a condition of insurance that you provide evidence of extensive Incoterm training. Because if this is not done right, and this is not done right, problems occur. And problems occur on many fronts. So obviously, misunderstandings by lack of knowledge in each of these departments, internal and external stakeholders, can occur. Another aspect is the sheer complexity or the sheer misunderstanding between what is domestic trade and what's international trade. And that gets a new dimension when it comes to Europe and the European Union, the UK and Brexit. Let me explain. Domestic trade is London to Manchester. Domestic trade is LA to New York. Domestic trade is Sydney to Perth. International trade is Sydney to Auckland. Everybody gets this. International trade is Seattle to Vancouver. But what about Berlin to Paris? What about Athens to Madrid? That's domestic trade. Why? Although it goes past several countries, it is domestic trade potentially, if, for example, done by truck, because we're in the European Union and the European Union has a single market. And as such, it is okay to pick up the goods with a bit of paperwork in Paris, and overnight you truck it to Madrid. The next morning it's in Madrid. There's no one going to stop you. You're just going to go straight through. You end up in a different country. There's no border. There's no nothing. Because of the European Union, we have an internal market, despite the fact that we have two different countries. That we constructed for the UK relations with the EU as well for 40 years. There was little difference from moving from London to Paris than from London to Edinburgh. But since Brexit, we moved from domestic to international trade. And now we have a customs border to deal with. Now we have much more friction because much more paperwork, much more cost, much more responsibility to lodge customs declaration, to do pre-departure declarations, to ensure that at the right time, the right declaration is in the right system. And if not, you're going to miss the ferry, you're going to miss the Eurostar, and that's going to cause delays, costs, and does not satisfy the customers. International trade is more complicated because of Brexit, but more generally, it's also more complicated because international trade is usually further apart. America to Japan has an ocean between it and many, many hours of flight. So the distances are bigger, the opportunities for risk and problems to occur is higher, the sailing times are longer, and there is a confusion and misunderstanding due to language, culture, business practices, law and finance options may be different, currency and exchange rate fluctuation, and of course, insurance rules may be different across the world. All of which why international trade is so much more complicated. And this is why it is difficult to propose a one-size-fits-all solution, which the Incoterms in a way are. But it also means that the Incoterms cannot be too specific. They can only be high level. They can only be a description, and they need an interpretation that you then need to provide. And this is why, again, the lawyers in the room need to be very careful, because it might not be sufficient in a contract to simply write X works. Boom. As if the three letters EXW decide everything. You might have to explain a little more. You might say X works to mean the following. Without repeating what the Incoterm means, you may have special stipulations that you need to put into the contract. What you cannot do is you cannot assume that everybody understands the same meaning for EXW than you. unless you tell them, unless there's a document that explains what EXW actually means for you, for your company, for your insurance provider. So in other words, thought leadership and a proactive approach to Incoterms is needed. Assuming that people know what Incoterms mean is less than diligent. It is all about obligations, risks, and costs. If you want to summarize this, this is what you need to understand. The obligations, who does what, who organizes the carriage or insurance of the goods, and who obtains shipping documents and export or import licenses. If we're not clear who gets the insurance, no insurance may be taken out. If we are not sure who gets an import license or who gets the export license, you may export something for which you're not authorized to carry out the export. Imagine you're sending something to Russia right now. I wouldn't want to do that without being sure that I have the right paperwork and I am permitted to export or even import this into your country. Risk where and when the seller delivers the goods. In other words, where the risk transfers from buyer and seller. You need to specify this, because if you don't, and say the goods fall off the truck as they're being loaded and they damage and it is millions of dollars, who's going to pay? Do you want to deal with this? This is crucial, obviously, for insurers, and the best way you can manage that is to, number one, understand the Incoterms, and number two, be very specific as to where this point is. The costs equally. Did you see how they go together? So obligations would say it is up to the seller, or say the buyer, to load the goods onto the truck. The risk means the moment the goods have been deposited into the truck, the risk transfers from A to B. And where the risks have transferred, this is where the costs transfer as well. So you can already see there's one crucial point, and this is where seller and buyer swap roles. Before, this buyer had the responsibility, say, to load the goods, but once they've been deposited, everything from this point forward is for the seller. And if you want to avoid headaches, you specify this point and because this is not law, you can be as specific as you wish. And this is the point for insurers. Place or the point of delivery is key, and you have to put that into your contracts. The place of delivery is the central factor that differentiates between the full family of rules and those four families between the individual rules. There are 11 Incoterms, and you can classify them in 4 different rules. In our longer training, if you want to take it, we spend 4 hours looking at every term in detail. So this is the training that I deliver to companies, to individuals that need to learn about Incoterms. And we make clear what this point is for each of the Incoterms. But for our purposes, this is the point that you want to focus on, because this is where the obligations, risks, and costs transfer from the seller to the buyer, or the buyer to the seller. And that place of delivery, that point of delivery, can be anywhere you both agree it to be. It could be right at the factory door where the goods are presented, or it could be at the end of the transaction where the buyer receives them. In day-to-day terms, you could think of it as we could do a supermarket style thing where I am producing the goods and you can pick them up. That would be me going to the supermarket to buy the milk. Or we could do the other thing, we could do the Amazon. I wait at home until you bring them to me. So at the first one, this buyer goes to the supermarket. So if there's an accident on the road, it is all for the buyer, and the supermarket is out of it. On the other hand, if the accident happens while the goods are in transit with the seller, the Amazon, then then that's not on the buyer. The buyer takes possession and then it's on them. So you can see how important it is to say at what point does what change. And don't forget, when I say at what point does what change, I am not ever talking about transfer of property or title of goods. Incoterms do not specify that. There's a whole different discussion we can have around that, but this is very clear. Do not start to talk to me about who owns the good at what point. Incoterms do not talk about this. There's also a place of destination. That is also important, and that is the place where the goods are actually going. And if you think about it, every transaction has a place of destination. So, for example, you could send goods to Shanghai, China. That would be your place of destination. This one, the place or the point of delivery, may be in Shanghai or anywhere else along the route. So if you're going from Hamburg to Shanghai, for example, the point of delivery where it swaps could be Hamburg, or it could be the place of destination. Understanding the difference between place and point of delivery and place of destination is fundamental. You streamline and simplify Incoterms. I know by now your head is already buzzing. You think, Arnie, you're not simplifying this. You're making it more difficult. Trust me, this is the simple part. You also need to have a think about mode of transport, and there are lots to choose from, including multimodal. And this is where we move from one road to air to rail to sea. We just mix it up. And this is a crucial another point, another area and aspect that you need to think about, because this is where the problems occur. You need to load it from one place, mode of transport, to another, from a truck to an airplane. And this is where a lot of things go wrong. So you need to clearly understand, and also the main mode of transport, so the airlift from Hamburg to China is Shanghai, is the most expensive part of it. So it is very important that you guys understand, or that everybody understands and clarifies, or the buyer and seller clarify, who's responsible for what leg of the journey, and who picks up the bulk costs, the bulk risk, and the bulk obligations of hiring the contract, the airplane, and making sure that when it's loaded correctly. So when the airplane hits turbulence, the goods are not damaged en route. Incoterms, therefore, if we summarize this, deal with the delivery, the risks, and the costs, and they do not determine the price, the method of payment, the transfer of ownership, or the consequences of breach of contract. Incoterms are not a substitute for a contract of sales. They reflect trade practices for all types of goods. They can be used for trading bulk cargo, containers, and pallets. There are 11 Incoterms, and if you go on a training with me, you can be happy because you're going to learn them all. You're going to learn them all. We have a methodology of going back and forth, and you even get to be picking your favorite one, and you're going to get to present your Incoterms and what they all mean to the others in our training. Yeah, so we have interactive session whereby you are the patron of one Incoterm, DAP or CIF, and you present it to us, the risks, the obligations, and the costs. So that's how you learn. As I've said, Incoterms reflect the same set of 10 standard business-to-business practices with variant obligations, risk, and costs for seller and buyer. In international trade, there are arguably 10 things that we need to clarify in every transaction. For every transaction, these 10 points need to be addressed. And the only thing that changes is the point at which we change obligations from buyer to seller. So what did we call it here? Do you remember? It is called a point of delivery, or the place of delivery. So we're looking, if we want to understand what these 11 Incoterms are, we're saying there are 10 standard parts in any transaction. And by shifting the point of delivery, different responsibility, risks, and costs occur. And it is this example of supermarket versus Amazon. And along that spectrum of the buyer does everything to the buyer does nothing, and the seller does nothing, and the seller does everything, this is where the Incoterm sits. And all we do is we shift responsibility rules along the way. And one of the aspects, for example, is insurance. Another one is transportation. A third one is loading and unloading, etc. I said there's this very important point you need to remember, and this is the point of destination, or no, sorry, the point of delivery. And that point needs to be specified. And I said to you, one of the key things you need to be doing in contracts is to refer to the year that you are mentioning, that you are the year of the Incoterms, so that we all know which rules set we are using. And secondly, this point place of delivery. So when you do Incoterms, this is how it's going to work. In contracts, and from now on forever, you shall write the Incoterms such as DAP, and then you can be as specific as you want. For example, number 123 ABC Street, Import Land, and then you follow up with Incoterms registered trademark 2020. So DAP, you name the Incoterm, then you give the point of delivery. I already told you why this is so important. Then you say Incoterms 2020, and that is the way you correctly incorporate Incoterms into contracts. If you pick up your contracts and it says DAP, the end, that's wrong. I do not know which DAP you mean, and I can argue everything. It is DAP details 2020. Example, CIF, Port of Spain, Incoterms 2020. That is correct. And you may think, well, hang on, why does he write Port of? That is a duplication. Well, it's not, because Port of Spain is actually the capital of Trinidad and Tobago. So therefore, the correct way to write this in a contract would be CIF, Port of Spain, Incoterms 2020. Please, costs, insurance, and freight to the port of the capital of Trinidad and Tobago, Incoterms 2020. Yeah, so that looks wrong, but it's actually right. And these kind of examples we're going to go through in our training. I'm going to come to an end in less than 4 minutes. So this is going to be quick because I want to give us time for questions. I want to give you this overview, and this could be really useful for you to use in your future work. So when you do get the slides, please have a look at it. And in our training, we're going to talk about it more. If you wanted, you'll get a link as to where you can book this, or I can come to you guys and give you training for your people if you want. You can see here the 4 families, the E families, the C families, the S, the F families, and the D families. And you can see here where this place, this point of delivery is. Sometimes it's called named port of shipment. Sometimes it's called named port of destination. And this simply means this is the place where we swap the responsibilities between seller and buyer. And also you will have a point because the freight, which is also the mode of transportation, which is the question who pays, who has the responsibility, and who has the risk. This is here written from the perspective of either buyer or seller, who has to collect the freight, who has to buy the freight, who has to arrange the freight. So here, for example, in X Works, the freight has to be collected by the buyer. And in DDP, the freight is prepaid by the seller. So you can see how this swaps. So this is a really good overview and a summary that you can use in your work. I mentioned these 10 standard aspects of every transaction. This is something that we will go into in the training, but you can imagine that with these Incoterms, if you choose the X Works, the FCA, the FAS, FOB, CFR, etc., if you choose this, you immediately deal with all of this. You deal with the general obligations, with where you take delivery or where the delivery takes place, the transfer of risk, the carriage, 5, the insurance. So this is determined already, as well as all the other details, including import, export, clearing, checking, and packaging, allocation of costs, etc. This is all dealt with the moment you decide on one of those. And depending on where your point of delivery is, either the seller or the buyer have to take certain obligations. Basically, we are interested in insurance, so I'm going to just quickly go over insurance, and I might run over a minute or so to just excuse that, but insurance obviously important. The level of insurance, it particularly matters, or is only described really in the Incoterms around CIF and CIP. I obviously says insurance. So it is CIP or CIF where insurance cover is mandated. The other ones do not talk about insurance, but that does not mean there isn't any insurance. It's just that is something you need to then specify in contracts. The level of insurance cover a CIP or CIF seller needs to be from an insurer that will depend on what those Incoterms will say about the level of cover due to the sales contract. So let's have a quick look at this. If you decide on, or if the parties transaction decide on a CIP Incoterm, then the seller is required to obtain maximum insurance cover complying with the all risk cover of the Institute Cargo Clauses A. Now, this is written in the Incoterms. If you agree something else, that's up to you. If you deal with CIF Incoterms, then you're only going to obtain insurance at the level specified by the Institute Cargo Clauses C. So, important to know, CIP, all risk cover, CIF, not all risk cover. So here's the explanation. I hope that's right. And that's pretty much for I guess maritime freight predominantly. And you can see here, it will matter to you if somebody agrees a CIP Incoterm or replaces the P with an F, because out of the sudden the cover is lower and the premiums are impacted, obviously. But this is the only reference that we can see in Incoterms regarding insurance. This does not mean, as I've said, that there shouldn't be any other insurance. That is something that you can agree as well. For example, under the Ex Works Incoterm, the buyer would be smart to have proper insurance because they are responsible for absolutely everything under the sun. I'm not going to go into the Ex Works seller's risk. I'm not going to go into the Ex Works buyer's risk, nor am I going to show you the opposite of DDP seller's risk and DDP buyer's risk, because I'm really interested in your questions. But this is fascinating stuff that I really recommend you take a closer look at, especially when it comes to Ex Works and DDP, because they're not suited for international trade at all. They are more suited for domestic trade. Also, I'm not going to mention variance, but in the training, we have a time to talk about variance because there are lots of different terms that you could be using. I've never heard of combi terms or Swedish variations of Incoterms. All of these should be avoided, but you should know that they exist. And if you're confronted with them, this is a big no-no. I want to close, and I'll be very interested in your questions by just reminding you that what I've tried to summarize here for 30 minutes exists in a 4-hour course training. This is where we have the time to go through each of the Incoterms in more detail and explain more what about the risk, the responsibility, and the costs. And more importantly, we have time to look at your Incoterm. So you're going to tell us which one you're going to use, or which one you see the most, or which one you're interested in, and we can deep dive into that one. It's the one where you get to learn all the Incoterms, where you see the difference between the different rules, where you understand what buyer and seller needs to do, and where you understand what at what step of the transaction the risk transfer between buyer and seller. These are the parts that we're going to cover in this course. So if you're interested in it, you can put it here, or we can have a chat after this training with the IUA and see what we can come up with. Maybe we can even develop our own IUA course for Incoterms, right? Do that online and make that a training for all of you. That would be pretty good, wouldn't it? And Lee, I should mention that we also offer a trade intelligence update service, which is a weekly compilation of customs and global trade updates. Now, here we are strictly talking about Incoterms, but as you know, import-export is very complex and the rules and the laws of the lands change all the time. Every Monday morning at 6 a.m., so today, we issue a magazine, online magazine in a block entry form, which tells you all the changes that occurred over the last week. We do that on Tuesday mornings with export controls and sanctions, which is very much related to risk, to due diligence, and also then covers the important aspects on maritime insurance claims. So if you want that, both of these are free of charge, and you can sign up to these on customsmanager.info for the information. And there's a live wrap-up session and a lunch and learn session that starts every Friday from 2024, where we do something like this. We have 30 minutes to wrap up on the news of the last week, and then 30 minutes where we have one training in a bite-sized lunch and learn coming to all those that want it. And don't forget, this trade intelligence update talks about Incoterms regularly. So just now we had a session on Incoterms and in form of blog entry. So if you want the learning to continue after this, or you want to be kept up to date on the latest of Incoterms, whenever something changes, we'll tell you about it, then this is the place where you can leave your email address, and then I'll send it to you in your inbox. That is as quick as I could make it. And with apologies, I ran 5 minutes over, but we still have about 10 minutes of beautiful questions and answers. So thank you very much for listening. I hope I didn't bombard you with too much information, but that was a whistle-stop tour of all matters Incoterm. And I'll get back to the chair. Chris?
Thank you, Arne. That was a great presentation, and the good news is, even though you skipped through some of those slides right towards the end, we are going to see the papers afterwards, and we've got your details. Just a couple of questions that we've seen. I was interested in the comments about training and building, and possibly, I think you said something on the lines of you'd want to build that into some sort of into the insurance contract, or in some way in terms of the risk management. Do you have a feel, Arne, for the level of training around Incoterms that actually happens at the moment? It feels like it might be, if I may say so, maybe a bit prohibitive in terms for the much smaller entities. Is that correct?
It shouldn't be, because if you're going to go into international trade, then you need to know what you're getting yourself into. International trade's not like domestic trade. If I'm going to play this game, I can reap a lot of benefits, but I need to play by the rules. And one of the most fundamental things is Incoterms training. There is a wide range of ways you can do that. If you're a small SME, you can even do that completely for free by just using YouTube. There's so many videos that you could use to learn about this. You can use Google. You can use ChatGPT if you want to, and that'll sort you out. The key point is, though, that you must have the right training, a professional training, and you must have a thorough understanding of what it means. So everyone who deals in international trade should be able to explain to me what their Incoterms mean, because how else can you sign a contract where you don't even know what you're signing? That is never recommended. And that means if you're going to play in international trade, you've got to know the rules. It's in your interest if you want long-term growth, and it avoids confusion later on. So as much as I respect the fact that, you might not, be the richest company in the world, there is no way you can operate successfully globally without understanding of Incoterms. And we're here to help, right? We can design less expensive solutions that work for everyone. And
so with that in mind, what happens when Incoterms are violated? Would that just be a contractual term that's dealt with in the normal ways you would in any other contractual term, or is there's no specified kind of dispute resolution around Incoterms or anything like that?
No, there's not. So you can build that into a contract. Again, the Incoterms, the advantage of the Incoterms is that they're not law, and they're rigid in the sense that they are what they are. I mean, they're written down and they should be respected as such. So they're rigid in that sense. But even within this, there is a very wording that's very generic, so it gives room for interpretation. And that's the benefit as well as occurs. It is up to then you and the clever legal team to fill the void. So where there is, the key to understand is that Incoterms by themselves are not law, are nothing. They are words on paper. They only become something when you incorporate that into law. And then that means it's commercial law and the fines are up to you. So for example, you could put in deliberate misuse of Incoterms or unintentional misuse of Incoterms will lead to the following results. But the key to remember is do it before you engage in transactions or before you agree to a certain policy, claim policy, because then you still have a chance to influence the thing. I mean, in the worst case, I suppose you guys won't pay because the Incoterms were violated. And if that happens, that can literally bankrupt the business overnight. So it's in everybody's interest to take the time it needs to sort out the Incoterms and not rush something, but make sure that everybody understands and have signed that they understand what the Incoterms mean. And if in doubt, what I would do as an insurer, I'd probably create a space somewhere on my website where I say, here are the Incoterms trainings that you can watch. I give it to you free of charge. Please, for each the Incoterm, you can watch this 10-minute video. And then if anything goes wrong or there is a question as to you didn't tell me, well, then you can say, well, I did. And here is a hub, the Incoterm hub, which explains how you should use them in our context with our company.
Thanks, Arnie. And another question: Do you find, because as I understand, the Incoterms have been incorporated into the underlying contracts, do you find then that you can sometimes have incompatible terms between the Incoterms and other, the transport contracts or even the insurance contract?
Yes, absolutely. And it is therefore so important that, again, everybody takes the time and makes sure there is no discrepancy between one contract and the other. Because it goes even as far as seller and buyer agree a contract, but then also have T's and C's, general T's and C's. And so the T's and C's then might be in conflict with the contract that you've agreed. Then there might be contracts that you sign with the subcontractor. So imagine you and I go into business together and I am responsible for arranging the freight, right? So I now have to contract with a freight forwarder who has another contract, and that also stipulates some Incoterms. So now I've got an Incoterm with you, but I've got another Incoterm with the freight forwarder, and I've got another Incoterm with this person, and so on and so on. So again, it is very important that the entire supply chain is mapped and you have clarity on how you trade with whom. And that starts, sorry for repeating myself, with understanding thoroughly the Incoterms.
Okay, and final question, just one from my side. Do you have a feel for the extent to which Incoterms are deviated from? People using the base contract and then tailoring it to their own needs? Does that happen on I'm thinking here about other entities trying to understand what the provisions are if there is a deviation and how that works in practical. And do you see that a lot?
Yeah, so I do. And there are two considerations. One is the unintentional deviation, and then there's the intentional one. So the unintended one, and both are Brexit examples and come from the import-export world. So please excuse me for that, but it's very potent. So when Europeans try to sell something on the UK market, before Brexit, you could just take the truck and go, and you would be in Manchester the next day. After Brexit, you now need to be an established entity in the UK. And if you're not, then you need to engage the services of an indirect representative, a customs agent. And that person would then simply import on the, say, the German company, on behalf of the German company, but then bill out the VAT to the UK company under DDP Incoterms. And all of that means is that the freight agent shouldn't bill out the VAT to the importer, because the DDP Incoterms require the German company to take care of the import VAT. I don't know if you follow, but the point is here we have deviated from DDP. We write in the contract, this is DDP, but it actually is not, because the realities on the ground are more likely DAP, or not even DAP, but they are DDP light or DAP plus, if you want. And so if that happens, you first have to recognize that you're not in the pure realm of DDP or DAP anymore, but you are in a mixture. And then no provision in DAP or DDP would allow you to do that if you were strict on the Incoterms, which means it is you can be challenged on it. And if there was an insurance claim, well, I can always say you didn't respect DDP rules because you charged me the VAT. And therefore, I'm rejecting this claim. In other words, if you are going to mess about with the Incoterms and you do it for your own reasons, write it in the contract so that it's clear. And then you can do what you want with it. You can massacre the Incoterms to the extent that you want. I do not recommend it. The ICC doesn't recommend it. Stick to what's on the paper. It worked for centuries, so it will work for you. But you can.
Thank you for that, Arnie. That seems like a good place to kind of draw the discussion to a close. We've hit our 1 hour scheduled time frame. But Arnie, thank you so much for that presentation. Really detailed. You're obviously an extremely knowledgeable person on this, and as you said before, you've been doing it for well over a decade. So I think everyone on the call has had a very informed presentation and discussion afterwards. As I said, we will circulate the slides of the presentation post-event, and also issues around CPD. And I'm sure Arnie and ourselves at IUA will be willing to have a further discussion for any questions arising, and certainly any training that Arnie and his company can provide. So thank you, Arnie. And thank you everyone for joining the call today. And we've got a whole suite of market briefings that my colleague Deborah Finch will be keeping you appraised of. And we look forward to seeing you at future presentations. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.